In a world where love knows no boundaries, some hearts dare to cross lines that society has drawn in blood. But when prejudice meets passion, and when ancient hatred collides with modern love, the price can be deadly. This is the story of a woman who fell in love with the wrong man in the eyes of her community, and how one moment of courage changed everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where keeping secrets was nearly impossible. Sarah Martinez had learned this the hard way over the past 18 months. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked toward the market, aware of the whispers that followed her like smoke from a dying fire. At 26, Sarah had once been the pride of her family. Her father, Robert Martinez, owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, and her mother, Elena, came from one of the oldest Spanish families in the region. Sarah had been educated in the city, spoke 3 languages, and had turned down marriage proposals from some of the wealthiest men in the state. But all of that seemed like a lifetime ago now. The trouble had started when she met James Crowfeather at the annual Harvest Festival. He wasn't supposed to be there. The Native American reservation was 15 miles away, and the invisible line between their worlds was rarely crossed. But James had business in town that day, selling handcrafted leather goods that had become surprisingly popular among the townspeople, though few would admit to buying them directly from him. Sarah had been arranging flowers at the church booth when a sudden gust of wind scattered her carefully prepared bouquets across the ground. She was on her hands and knees gathering the scattered blooms, when a pair of worn leather boots appeared in her line of sight. She looked up to see a man with kind dark eyes and strong hands already collecting the flowers she couldn't reach. "Thank you," she had said, accepting the flowers from his outstretched hand. Their fingers touched briefly, and she felt something she had never experienced before, a spark that seemed to travel from her fingertips straight to her heart. "You're welcome," James replied, his voice deep and warm. He spoke English perfectly, with just a trace of an accent that Sarah would later learn came from his grandmother, who had insisted he never forget the old language. That brief encounter should have been the end of it. In any other time, in any other place, it would have been. But Sarah found herself thinking about the stranger with the gentle eyes and the calloused hands of someone who worked with purpose. She made excuses to visit the parts of town where she might see him again, telling herself she was just curious, nothing more. The second time they met was at the creek that ran along the border between the town and the reservation. Sarah had ridden out alone, something she did often when she needed to think. She had dismounted to let her horse drink, when she saw James sitting on a fallen log, sketching something in a leather-bound notebook. "We meet again," he had said, looking up from his drawing. "Though I suppose this time it's not entirely by chance." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "I come here often to think. I didn't know anyone else knew about this spot. My grandmother used to bring me here when I was a boy," James said, closing his notebook and standing. "She said the water here held the memories of both our peoples, back when there was peace between us." They talked for 2 hours that day. James told her about his work as a teacher on the reservation, how he was trying to preserve their traditional crafts while also preparing the children for the modern world. Sarah shared her frustrations with the limitations placed on her as a woman, even in her privileged position, and her dreams of seeing more of the world beyond Millbrook. When she finally returned home that evening, her mother was waiting on the porch, her face stern with disapproval. "Where have you been, Sarah? Your father was looking for you." "Just writing, Mama. You know how I like to clear my head." Elena Martinez studied her daughter's face carefully. "Be careful, mija. There are dangers in this world that you may not see clearly. Not everyone who seems kind has good intentions." Sarah had dismissed her mother's warning then, but as the weeks passed and her secret meetings with James became more frequent, she began to understand the weight of those words. They met at different places, always careful to avoid being seen together. The creek, an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town, sometimes just walking along the old hunting trails that crisscrossed the hills. With each meeting, Sarah felt herself falling deeper into something she couldn't name. James was unlike any man she had ever known. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and he challenged her thoughts in ways that made her see the world differently. He was educated and well-read, fluent in philosophy and literature, but he also possessed a practical wisdom that came from living close to the land and understanding the cycles of nature. "You know this can't last," James had said one evening, as they sat watching the sunset from a hill overlooking both the town and the reservation. "What we're doing, it's dangerous for both of us, but especially for you." Sarah had taken his hand then, lacing her fingers through his. "I know what people will think, but I also know what I feel, and I've never felt anything like this before." James had turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. My people have a saying, the heart knows no boundaries, but the world is full of walls. I care about you more than I should, Sarah. More than is wise for either of us. Then let's be unwise. Sarah had whispered, and when he kissed her, she knew there would be no going back. The relationship remained secret for 6 months. Sarah became an expert at creating believable excuses for her absences, and James was careful to vary his routes to their meeting places. But in a small town, secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when those secrets challenge the very foundations of how people see their world. The first crack in their carefully constructed secrecy came from an unexpected source. Tommy Fletcher, a ranch hand who worked for Sarah's father, had been poaching deer in the hills near the reservation. He was returning from an unsuccessful hunt when he saw 2 figures silhouetted against the dying light of day, and something about their closeness made him curious enough to investigate. What he saw through his field glasses made his blood run cold. Sarah Martinez, the daughter of his employer, was in the arms of a Native American man, and they were clearly more than friends. Tommy's first instinct was to march straight to Robert Martinez and report what he had seen. But then he realized that information like this could be worth more than his monthly wages. Tommy began following Sarah whenever he could manage it without neglecting his duties. He documented her meetings with James, noting times and places, building a file of evidence that he planned to use to his advantage. He wasn't sure yet how he would leverage what he knew, but he was certain that such explosive information would eventually prove valuable. Meanwhile, Sarah and James had begun discussing their future in earnest. The constraints of their situation were becoming unbearable, and they both knew that continuing to meet in secret was unsustainable. I've been thinking about going north, James told her one afternoon as they sat in the shelter of an old oak tree. There are places where what we are wouldn't matter so much. Places where we could build a life together. Sarah had been quiet for a long time before responding. You mean run away? I mean start over. Somewhere we can be together without fear, without hiding. The idea both thrilled and terrified Sarah. She loved James with a depth that surprised her, but leaving everything she had ever known was a huge step. Her family, despite their flaws, meant everything to her. The ranch had been in her family for 3 generations. Could she really walk away from all of that? I need time to think, she had told him, and James had nodded, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. But time was the one thing they didn't have. Tommy Fletcher had grown tired of waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his secret, and he had also grown bolder in his surveillance. 3 days after James had proposed they leave together, Tommy made a critical error in judgment. He had been following Sarah to one of her meetings when he got too close, stepping on a dry branch that cracked like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon air. Sarah spun around, her heart pounding, and saw Tommy trying to duck behind a tree. Tommy Fletcher, you come out from there right now, Sarah called, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Tommy emerged from his hiding place, his face red with embarrassment and something else, something that looked like malicious satisfaction. Miss Martinez, he said, touching his hat in a mockery of respect. Fancy meeting you out here so far from home. What do you want, Tommy? Oh, I think you know what I want, Tommy replied, his voice taking on a tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. The question is, what are you willing to give me to keep your little secret safe? Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. This was the moment she had always known might come, but she had pushed it to the back of her mind, hoping against hope that it never would. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew how futile they sounded. Tommy laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Miss Martinez, I've been watching you for weeks. I know all about your meetings with that native boy. I know how you look at him, how he touches you, and I know what your daddy would do if he found out his precious daughter was consorting with the enemy. The word enemy hit Sarah like a physical blow. Is that really how people saw James? As an enemy rather than a human being? What do you want? Sarah asked again, this time her voice barely above a whisper. I want what any man wants, Tommy said, stepping closer. I want a chance at the good life. And you're going to help me get it. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, she heard footsteps behind her. James emerged from the trees, having heard voices and come to investigate. When he saw Tommy standing so close to Sarah, his face looking predatory and dangerous. Every protective instinct he possessed flared to life. Step away from her, James said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable threat. Tommy's eyes lit up with cruel delight. Well, well, the savage shows himself. This is even better than I hoped. I said step away from her, or what? Tommy sneered. You'll scalp me? Isn't that what your kind does? James moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to hunt before he could properly walk. In 3 quick steps he was between Tommy and Sarah, his body positioned protectively. "Your quarrel is with me now," James said. "Leave her out of this." Tommy backed up a step, suddenly realizing that he might have overplayed his hand. James was taller and broader than he had appeared from a distance, and there was something in his dark eyes that suggested he was not a man to underestimate. "There's no quarrel here," Tommy said, trying to inject conciliation into his voice. "Just neighbors having a conversation." "But I think Miss Martinez's father might be very interested in knowing what kind of conversations his daughter has been having." "And what makes you think he would believe the word of a ranch hand against his own daughter?" James asked. "Because I have proof," Tommy said, his confidence returning. "I've been documenting your little meetings for weeks. Times, places, even some drawings of what I witnessed. Very detailed drawings." Sarah felt sick. The thought of this man watching them, recording their private moments, felt like a violation beyond words. "What do you want?" James asked, echoing Sarah's earlier question. "I want Miss Martinez to marry me," Tommy said. And Sarah gasped in shock. A man with the right wife can go far in this world, and if she's not willing to do that, well, then maybe her father needs to know what kind of daughter he's raised. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the trees and Sarah's rapid breathing. She looked at Tommy's leering face, then at James, whose expression had gone completely still in the way she had learned, meant he was thinking very carefully about his next move. "You're insane," Sarah finally said. "My father would never force me to marry you, no matter what lies you told him." "Maybe not," Tommy agreed. "But he sure wouldn't let you keep meeting with your native boyfriend here. In fact, I suspect he might take some pretty drastic action to make sure that never happened again." "And your boyfriend here, well, there's no telling what might happen to him if word got out that he'd been defiling a white woman." The threat was clear, and Sarah realized with growing horror that Tommy was probably right about her father's potential reaction. Robert Martinez was a fair man in many ways, but he was also a product of his time and place, and those times and places had not been kind to relationships that crossed racial lines. "Give us a week to think about it," James said suddenly. Sarah looked at him in shock. "James, no." "A week," James repeated, his eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "Then we'll give you our answer." Tommy considered this, clearly pleased with how the confrontation had played out. "But don't try anything stupid like running away. I'll be watching, and if you disappear, I'll go straight to your father with what I know." After Tommy left, Sarah and James stood in silence for a long time. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely audible. "We have to run. Tonight. We can't let him destroy our lives." But James was shaking his head. "If we run now, we'll be running forever. He'll make sure of that. And your family will never forgive you for disappearing without a word." "So what are you suggesting? That I marry that horrible man?" "I'm suggesting we find another way. 1 week gives us time to think, to plan." "Plan what?" James turned to look at her, and Sarah saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. A hardness, a resolve that spoke of difficult decisions and necessary actions. "I'm going to talk to my grandfather. He's dealt with men like Tommy Fletcher before, and then we're going to end this, one way or another." As they parted ways that evening, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their stolen moments of happiness were coming to an end, and that what lay ahead would test everything they thought they knew about love, courage, and the price of defying a world determined to keep them apart. The week that followed was the longest of Sarah's life. She tried to maintain her normal routine, but everything felt different now. Every glance from her parents seemed loaded with suspicion. Every casual question about her whereabouts felt like an interrogation. Tommy Fletcher had taken to tipping his hat to her whenever their paths crossed, his smile a constant reminder of the sword hanging over her head. Meanwhile, James had indeed sought counsel from his grandfather, a man whose wisdom was respected throughout their community. What the old man told him would shape everything that was about to happen, though neither Sarah nor James could have predicted just how dramatically their world was about to change. James Walking Bear was 93 years old and had seen the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable to his younger self. He had witnessed the last of the buffalo hunts, the coming of the railroad, 2 world wars, and the slow, painful process of his people adapting to a world that seemed determined to erase them. When his grandson came to him with this problem, the old man listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "You love this woman," Walking Bear said when James finished his story. It wasn't a question. "Yes, grandfather, more than my own life. And she loves you the same way?" "I believe she does." Walking Bear was quiet for a long time. staring out at the mountains that had watched over their people for countless generations. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. There was a time, before the soldiers came, when love between peoples was not so strange. Your grandmother's mother was Navajo. My own great-grandmother was Mexican. Love finds a way, but the world must be willing to let it grow. He turned to look at his grandson. This man who threatens you, he is a coward. Cowards are dangerous because they fight without honor, but they are also weak because they fear losing what little they have. What would you do, grandfather? I would remember that sometimes the best way to deal with a snake is not to kill it, but to let it bite itself. James didn't understand what his grandfather meant at first, but as the old man continued talking, a plan began to form. It was risky, and it required perfect timing, but it just might work. While James was consulting with his grandfather, Sarah was dealing with her own family crisis. Her mother had noticed her distraction, and her father had commented on her lack of appetite at dinner. On Thursday evening, 3 days after the confrontation with Tommy Fletcher, her parents asked her to join them in the sitting room for what they called a serious conversation. Sarah, her father began, his voice gentle but firm. Your mother and I are concerned about you. You seem troubled lately, distracted. Is there something you need to tell us? Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was sure her parents could hear it. Had Tommy already spoken to them? Was this the moment when everything fell apart? I'm fine, Papa. Just tired, I suppose. Her mother leaned forward in her chair. Mija, we've been talking, your father and I. We think perhaps it's time for you to consider marriage. You're 26 now, and while we've never pressured you before, we worry about your future. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and dread. They didn't know about James, but they were pushing her toward the very thing that Tommy Fletcher was trying to force. I'm not ready for marriage, Sarah said carefully. But you should be thinking about it, her father replied. In fact, there's a young man who's expressed interest in calling on you. He's hardworking, respectable, and he comes from good people. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Who? Tommy Fletcher, her mother said with a smile. He spoke to your father just yesterday, said he's been admiring you from afar and would like permission to court you properly. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. Tommy had been even more clever than she realized. By approaching her father directly, he had positioned himself as the honorable suitor, while simultaneously setting up his backup plan. If she refused him, he could still expose her relationship with James, but now he would look like the wounded party, the decent man whose affections had been spurned for a savage. I don't want to be courted by Tommy Fletcher, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. Why not? Her father asked, genuinely puzzled. He's a good worker, reliable, and he clearly cares for you. I don't feel that way about him. Her parents exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that comes from decades of marriage. Sarah, her mother said gently, love often comes after marriage, not before. Your father and I had an arranged marriage, and look how happy we've been. Times are different now, Mama.
Not so different that a woman can afford to be too particular, her father said, his voice taking on a firmer tone.
You've turned down several good men over the years. People are starting to talk. Let them talk. That's easy to say when you're young and idealistic, Robert Martinez said, leaning back in his chair. But reputation matters in this world, especially for a woman, and Tommy Fletcher is offering you security, respectability. Sarah felt trapped. Every word her parents spoke pushed her further into Tommy's web. She wanted to scream, to tell them the truth about what kind of man Tommy really was, but she knew they would never believe her without proof, and the only proof would expose her relationship with James. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, her mother said, reaching over to pat her hand. But don't take too long, Mija. Good men don't wait forever. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling like the walls of her room were closing in around her. She had to find a way to meet with James, to tell him what had happened, but Tommy's warning about watching her made her afraid to leave the house. Finally, she decided to take a terrible risk. The next morning, Sarah told her mother she was going to visit her friend Catherine Morrison, who lived on a small farm about 2 miles from town. Instead, she rowed hard toward the old creek where she and James had first talked, praying that he would somehow know to meet her there. James was waiting for her, and the relief Sarah felt at seeing him nearly brought her to tears. She threw herself into his arms, holding him as if he might disappear. I was hoping you would come, he said, stroking her hair. I have news. Sarah pulled back to look at him. So do I, and none of it is good. They sat on their old log and shared what had happened over the past few days. James told her about his conversation with his grandfather and the plan they had developed. Sarah told him about her parents' dinner conversation and Tommy's clever maneuvering. "He's smarter than we gave him credit for," James said grimly. "So what do we do?" "We follow my grandfather's advice. We let the snake bite itself," James explained the plan Walking Bear had suggested. It was audacious and dangerous, but it was also their only real option. The key was to make Tommy Fletcher reveal his true nature in front of witnesses who couldn't ignore what they saw. "My grandfather says Tommy's type of man always overplays his hand when he thinks he's winning. We're going to give him the chance to do exactly that." The plan required Sarah to agree to Tommy's marriage proposal, but only as a way to lure him into a trap. They would arrange for the engagement to be announced at a public gathering where Tommy would feel confident enough to drop his guard. Once he did that, James would be ready with evidence of Tommy's real character. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah asked. James smiled for the first time since their conversation began. "My grandfather has lived in this area for 93 years. He knows things about most families that go back generations, including things about the Fletcher family that Tommy probably doesn't even know." Over the next 2 days, James and his grandfather worked together to uncover information that would destroy Tommy's reputation. What they found was even better than they had hoped. Tommy's father had been involved in a cattle rustling operation 20 years earlier, something that had been covered up when he died in what was officially called a riding accident. Tommy's uncle had been caught cheating at cards and run out of 2 different towns. And most damaging of all, Tommy himself had been suspected of stealing supplies from other ranchers, though nothing had ever been proven. But Walking Bear's real stroke of genius was discovering that Tommy had been writing letters to a woman in Denver, promising to marry her as soon as he had enough money to bring her west. The letters had been intercepted by the tribal postal clerk, who was Walking Bear's nephew and who had been suspicious of Tommy's unusual correspondence. Armed with this information, James was ready to spring their trap. The venue would be the monthly town social, held in the church hall every 3rd Saturday. It was the kind of gathering where everyone in Millbrook came together, where news was shared and reputations were made or destroyed. Sarah's part in the plan was the hardest. She had to convince her parents that she had reconsidered Tommy's proposal and was now willing to accept his courtship. The conversation was one of the most difficult of her life. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told her parents on Friday evening. "About Tommy Fletcher." Her mother's face brightened immediately. "And I think perhaps I've been too hasty in my judgment. If he's truly interested in courting me, I would be willing to consider it." Her father beamed with satisfaction. "I'm glad you're being sensible about this, Sarah. Tommy will make you a good husband." The engagement was announced at the town social the following evening. Tommy couldn't hide his smugness as he stood beside Sarah in front of the assembled townspeople, his arm possessively around her waist. Sarah smiled and played her part, but inside she felt sick every time Tommy touched her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert Martinez called for attention, "I have the pleasure of announcing the engagement of my daughter Sarah to Mr. Benya, Tommy Fletcher. They plan to be married this fall." The crowd erupted in polite applause, though Sarah noticed several people exchanging glances that seemed more concerned than celebratory. She wondered how many others had seen something in Tommy that made them uneasy. Tommy basked in the attention, shaking hands with the men and accepting congratulations from the women. As the evening progressed, he grew more confident, more talkative, and eventually more careless with his words. The trap was sprung during the dance that followed the dinner. Tommy had consumed several glasses of the punch that some of the men had spiked with whiskey, and his tongue was looser than usual. Sarah was dancing with him when she spotted James near the edge of the crowd, dressed in his best clothes and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "Sarah, darling," Tommy said, his words slightly slurred, "you have no idea how long I've waited for this moment."
"Oh?"
Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice light. "I've been planning this for months, watching you, figuring out the best way to make you mine."
He pulled her closer, his grip uncomfortably tight.
"I knew all about your little adventure with that native boy. Knew it from the very beginning." Sarah's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" Tommy laughed at the sound harsh and unpleasant. "Did you really think you were being clever? Sneaking around with that savage?" "I saw you together long before I confronted you. I just waited for the right moment to use what I knew." "I don't understand." "Of course you don't. You're just a silly girl who thought she could play with fire without getting burned." But I'm a man who knows how to get what he wants. His grip tightened further, and Sarah winced. Your Indian boyfriend won't be bothering us much longer, I can promise you that. What does that mean? It means that some of the boys and I are planning a little visit to the reservation next week. Going to make sure he understands that he's not welcome around here anymore. Permanently. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Tommy was talking about violence, possibly murder, and he was doing it in front of witnesses. She looked around desperately and saw that several people had stopped dancing and were listening to their conversation with expressions of growing alarm. At that moment, James stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. "Excuse me," he said politely, addressing the assembled dancers. "I couldn't help but overhear Mr. Barge, Fletcher's plans for next week. I wonder if you might elaborate on what kind of visit he has in mind." The dancing stopped completely now, and everyone turned to stare at James. A murmur ran through the crowd as people recognized him, and Sarah could practically feel the tension in the room ratchet up several levels. Tommy's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I was invited," James replied calmly. "Mrs. Morrison asked me to deliver some leather goods to her tonight, and she suggested I stay for the social. I hope that's all right with everyone." Catherine Morrison, who had indeed invited James as part of the plan, stepped forward. "Of course it is, James. You're always welcome." Tommy looked around the room, realizing that his earlier words had been heard by far more people than he had intended. "This isn't any of your business, native." "Actually," James said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I think it might be. You see, I have some information that the people of Millbrook might find interesting about your character and your intentions." He pulled out a bundle of papers, including the letters Tommy had written to the woman in Denver and the documentation of his family's criminal activities. "For instance," James continued, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall, "I have here several letters in your handwriting, Mr. Fletcher, promising marriage to one Miss Ruth Hawkins of Denver. The most recent one is dated just 2 weeks ago." The crowd gasped, and Sarah saw her father's face darken with fury. Tommy's engagement to Sarah had just been announced, and now there was evidence that he was already promised to another woman. "Those are forgeries," Tommy shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. "I also have here," James continued, "documentation of your father's involvement in the cattle rustling operation of 1905, your uncle's gambling debts and subsequent flight from justice, and evidence of your own theft from several ranches in the area." Walking Bear appeared beside his grandson, moving with the silent grace that had made him a legendary hunter in his youth. In his hands, he held additional papers. "I have been keeping records for many years," the old man said, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "Records of who can be trusted and who cannot. Thomas Fletcher, you are a man without honor, and now everyone knows it." Tommy's face had gone from red to white, and Sarah could see the panic in his eyes as he realized his carefully constructed plans were crumbling around him. "You can't believe these savages over a white man," he shouted desperately. "They're lying. They're trying to protect their own kind." But the damage was done. Robert Martinez stepped forward, his face grim with anger and embarrassment. "Sarah," he said quietly, "step away from this man." Sarah had never been happier to obey her father. She moved quickly to stand beside Catherine Morrison, as far from Tommy as she could get. "Mr. Fletcher," Robert continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "if these allegations are true, then you have brought shame not only on yourself but on my family by associating us with your dishonor. I hereby withdraw my permission for you to court my daughter." "You can't do this," Tommy protested. "I have rights. I have a claim on her." "You have no claim on anyone," James said firmly. "And if I were you, I would be very careful about making threats against anyone else. There are a lot of witnesses here tonight who heard you talking about violence." Sheriff Patterson, who had been standing near the back of the crowd, stepped forward. "Tommy Fletcher, I think you and I need to have a conversation about those theft allegations, and about your plans for visiting the reservation." As the sheriff moved toward him, Tommy's last vestige of control snapped. He looked around the room wildly, seeing nothing but hostile faces and disappointed expressions. His gaze fell on Sarah, and his expression twisted into something ugly. "This is all your fault, you little whore," he screamed, lunging toward her. "If you hadn't been spreading your legs for that savage, none of this would have happened." But Tommy never reached Sarah. James intercepted him halfway across the room, catching him in a grip that immobilized him completely. "That's enough," James said quietly. But his voice carried a menace that made Tommy stop struggling immediately. The room erupted in shocked voices and angry mutters. What Tommy had just said was unforgivable in any context, but to say it publicly, in front of the entire town, was social suicide. Even those who might have harbored sympathy for his position were now completely turned against him. Sheriff Patterson reached them and put his hand on Tommy's arm. "Thomas Fletcher, you're under arrest for theft, for making threats, and for disturbing the peace. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it." As Tommy was led away, still shouting incoherently about injustice and conspiracies, the crowd began to disperse. Many people came to Robert Martinez to express their shock and sympathy that his family had been subjected to such a scene. Others approached James and Walking Bear to thank them for their courage in exposing Tommy's true nature. But Sarah barely noticed any of this. All she could see was the look of hurt and confusion in her father's eyes when he finally approached her. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we need to talk."
The ride home was conducted in complete silence, and when they reached the house, Sarah's parents asked her to join them in the sitting room.
This time, however, the atmosphere was very different from their previous conversation. "Is it true?" her mother asked without preamble. "What that horrible man said about you and James Crowfeather?" Sarah looked at her parents. These people who had raised her and loved her and tried to protect her from a world they saw as dangerous. She thought about lying, about trying to maintain the fiction that might preserve their relationship. But she was tired of secrets and tired of living in fear.
"Yes," she said simply.
"It's true. I love him, and he loves me." Her father was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with sadness and confusion. "How long has this been going on?" 8 months. "And you never thought to tell us?" "I was afraid." Afraid of exactly what happened tonight. Elena Martinez looked at her daughter with tears in her eyes. "Mija, do you understand what this means? What people will say? I understand that people will judge us for loving each other, but I also understand that what James and I have is real and honest, which is more than I can say for what Tommy Fletcher was offering." Robert Martinez stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. "This James Crowfeather, what kind of man is he? He's kind and intelligent and hard-working. He's a teacher, Papa. He speaks 4 languages, and he's read more books than most of the men in this town. He treats me with respect and dignity, and he makes me want to be a better person. But he's an Indian. He's a human being. He's a human being, just like us." Robert turned around to face his daughter. "Sarah, I won't pretend that this doesn't change things. I won't pretend that this will be easy for any of us. But what I saw tonight was a man who put himself at considerable risk to protect you and to do what was right. That counts for something." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "Does that mean?" "It means we need to meet this young man properly. It means we need to understand what we're dealing with before we make any decisions about the future." It wasn't the acceptance Sarah had dreamed of, but it was more than she had dared to hope for. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there might be a path forward that didn't require her to choose between love and family. But as they would all learn in the days to come, Tommy Fletcher's public humiliation had not ended his capacity for causing harm. In fact, it had only made him more desperate and more dangerous. The jail cell in Millbrook was small and damp, with iron bars that had been installed during the town's mining boom 30 years earlier. Tommy Fletcher sat on a narrow cot, his head in his hands, replaying the events of the evening over and over again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the townspeople as they turned against him, heard their voices as they condemned him, felt the humiliation of being arrested in front of everyone he had ever known. But it wasn't remorse that consumed Tommy Fletcher, it was rage. He had been in jail for 3 days when his cousin Eddie came to visit. Eddie Fletcher was cut from the same cloth as Tommy, though he was cleverer about hiding his true nature. He worked as a ranch hand for a spread 20 miles south of Millbrook, and his reputation there was solid enough that his employer trusted him with increasingly important responsibilities. But Eddie had inherited the same mean streak that ran through the Fletcher bloodline, and he shared Tommy's resentment of anyone who seemed to have more than their fair share of luck or happiness. "You look like hell, cousin," Eddie said, settling into the chair across from Tommy's cell. "I feel worse than I look," Tommy replied. "Did you hear what happened?" "Word travels fast. Something about you getting shown up by an Indian and his grandfather?" "They set me up, Eddie. That whole engagement announcement was a trap, and I walked right into it. What are you going to do about it?" What can I do? I'm stuck in here until the circuit judge comes through next month. By then, everyone will have forgotten about me and moved on to the next piece of gossip. Eddie was quiet for a moment, studying his cousin's face. Maybe not everyone needs to forget, he said finally. What do you mean? I mean, maybe there's a way to make sure people remember what happens when someone crosses a Fletcher. Maybe there's a way to send a message that will keep folks from thinking they can humiliate us without consequences. Tommy looked up, and for the first time since his arrest, there was something other than despair in his eyes. What did you have in mind?
Eddie glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer to the bars.
You said that Martinez girl has been meeting with the Indian boy. You know where they usually go? Several places. But there's one spot by the old creek where they've been meeting for months. And you think they'll keep meeting there, even after all this? Tommy considered the question. Despite everything that had happened, he was certain that Sarah and James would find a way to continue seeing each other. People like that, people who thought love could conquer everything, were predictable in their stubbornness. Yeah, he said. They'll keep meeting. They're too stupid and too sentimental to do otherwise. Eddie smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then maybe it's time someone taught them what happens to people who don't know their place in the world. What are you talking about, Eddie? I'm talking about an old-fashioned lesson in respect, the kind our grandfathers used to teach when the natural order of things was threatened. Tommy felt a chill run down his spine. He was angry, angrier than he had ever been in his life. But what Eddie was suggesting went far beyond anything he had contemplated. Eddie, if you're talking about what I think you're talking about, that's dangerous territory. People aren't going to stand for that kind of thing anymore. People will stand for whatever they have to stand for, as long as nobody forces them to take sides. The key is to make sure it looks like an accident, or better yet, like something the Indians brought on themselves. Eddie outlined his plan in whispers, and with each detail, Tommy felt himself being drawn deeper into something that he knew would change everything forever. But his anger and humiliation were stronger than his fear, and by the time Eddie left the jail, they had agreed on a course of action that would either restore Tommy's reputation or destroy them both. Meanwhile, Sarah and James were indeed continuing to meet, though now with the knowledge and grudging permission of Sarah's parents. Robert Martinez had insisted on meeting James formally, and that conversation had taken place 2 days after the social. It had been awkward and tense, but it had also been honest, and by the end of it, Robert had grudgingly admitted that James Crowfeather was not the savage he had expected. I still don't like this situation, Robert told Sarah after James had left their house following a dinner that had been stilted but civil. And I won't pretend that I understand how you can throw away everything you've been raised to value for this relationship. I'm not throwing anything away, Papa. I'm choosing to build something new. The world isn't ready for what you're choosing, Mija. There will be consequences. There are always consequences for any important choice. The question is whether we're willing to accept them in order to live authentically. Robert studied his daughter's face and saw something there that reminded him of his own wife when she was young, a determination that could not be swayed by fear or convention.
If this is truly what you want, he said finally, then your mother and I will support you.
We may not understand it and we may not like it, but you're our daughter, and that matters more than anything else. It was more than Sarah had dared hope for, and she threw her arms around her father with tears streaming down her face. But while Sarah was reconciling with her family, Tommy Fletcher's cousin Eddie was gathering allies for his plan. He started with men he knew shared his views about the proper order of society, men who had grown up hearing stories about the Indian Wars and who believed that the current peace was an unnatural state that needed to be corrected from time to time. He found willing listeners in Jake Morrison, a mean-spirited man who had always resented his sister Catherine's friendship with people from the reservation, and Pete Williams, who had lost his job to a Native American worker the previous year and blamed all his subsequent troubles on what he called the government's favoritism towards savages. Eddie was careful to present his plan as a matter of community safety rather than personal revenge. He talked about the need to send a message that would discourage other unnatural relationships and maintain the boundaries that kept their community stable and safe. He spoke of tradition and honor and the responsibility of white men to protect white women from their own misguided impulses. By the end of the week, Eddie had assembled a group of 6 men who were willing to participate in what he euphemistically called a lesson in proper behavior. The plan was simple and brutal. They would wait for Sarah and James to meet at their usual spot by the creek. Then they would take James prisoner and deliver the kind of justice that had once been common on the frontier. What they planned to do with Sarah was left deliberately vague, but Eddie made it clear that she needed to be taught that actions had consequences, and that some consequences were more permanent than others. The group met on Saturday night in the barn on Pete Williams' property. finalizing the details of their plan. They would strike on Sunday afternoon, when most people were either in church or resting at home. Eddie had learned from one of his contacts in town that Sarah had been seen riding toward the creek area the previous Sunday, and he was betting she would follow the same pattern. Remember, Eddie told his co-conspirators as they prepared to leave, this isn't about revenge. This is about maintaining order. This is about making sure everyone understands that some lines cannot be crossed without consequences. But even as he spoke the words, Eddie knew that what they were planning was exactly about revenge. Tommy's humiliation had become the Fletcher family's humiliation, and that could not be allowed to stand. If they succeeded in their plan, Tommy would be vindicated and their family's reputation would be restored. If they failed, well, Eddie preferred not to think about what failure might mean. Sunday dawned clear and warm, with the kind of golden light that made the prairie grass look like waves on an ocean of gold. Sarah had indeed planned to meet James at their usual spot, though now their meetings had a different character than they once had. With her parents' knowledge and reluctant acceptance, there was no longer any need for secrecy. But there was also a weight of expectation that hadn't been there before. James had been thinking a great deal about the future since the social, and he had reached some difficult conclusions. He loved Sarah more than he had ever thought it possible to love another person. But he also understood that their relationship would always be a lightning rod for people's fears and prejudices. The incident with Tommy Fletcher had shown him just how explosive those feelings could be, and he wondered if continuing to pursue a relationship with Sarah was fair to her or her family. When they met that afternoon by the creek, James was unusually quiet, and Sarah could sense that something was troubling him. "What's wrong?" she asked, taking his hand as they sat on their familiar log. "I've been thinking about what happened last week, about what people said, what they threatened. James, Tommy Fletcher, is in jail. He can't hurt us anymore. Tommy Fletcher was just one man. There are others who feel the same way he does, others who might be even more dangerous because they're smarter about hiding their intentions." Sarah felt a chill of fear, though she tried not to let it show. "Are you saying you want to end this? End us?" "I'm saying I love you too much to want to see you hurt because of me. Your family is just starting to accept our relationship. Your father was actually cordial to me the other night, but if there's more trouble, more confrontation, that could all disappear. So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe we should consider leaving, going somewhere where what we are isn't so unusual, where we can build a life without constantly looking over our shoulders." Sarah was quiet for a long time, watching the water flow over the rocks in the creek bed. She had known this conversation was coming ever since the social, but that didn't make it any easier to contemplate. "I've been thinking about the same thing," she admitted. "But every time I try to imagine leaving my family, leaving everything I've ever known, I feel terrified." "Fear is natural," James said gently. "The question is whether the thing we're afraid of is worse than the thing we're trying to avoid." They were so absorbed in their conversation that neither of them noticed the group of men approaching through the trees until it was too late to run. Eddie Fletcher stepped into the clearing first, followed by his 5 companions, all of them carrying rifles and wearing expressions of grim determination. "Well, well," Eddie said, his voice carrying a mockery of friendliness. "Look what we have here. A little love nest by the creek." Sarah and James stood up immediately, James positioning himself protectively in front of Sarah. "What do you want?" James asked, his voice calm despite the danger he could see in the men's faces. "We want to have a conversation about respect," Eddie replied. "About knowing your place in the world and staying in it." "We're not bothering anyone," Sarah said, stepping around James to face the men directly. "We have every right to be here." Jake Morrison laughed harshly. "Rights? You think you have rights to shame your family and your race by consorting with this savage?" "James is not a savage," Sarah said firmly. "He's a better man than any of you." The words were barely out of her mouth when Pete Williams stepped forward and backhanded her across the face. The blow sent Sarah stumbling backwards, and James exploded into motion, catching Williams with a punch that dropped him to the ground. But before James could press his advantage, the other men rushed forward, and within seconds he was overwhelmed by superior numbers. They beat him systematically and efficiently, using their rifle butts and their fists until he lay motionless on the ground. "Now then," Eddie said, breathing heavily from the exertion, "let's discuss what happens next." Sarah knelt beside James, trying to see if he was still breathing, trying to assess the extent of his injuries. She could see blood, a lot of it, and his face was already swelling from the beating. "He needs a doctor," she said desperately. "What he needs," Eddie replied, "is a lesson he'll never forget. What you both need is to understand that some things are not acceptable in civilized society, Eddie gestured to his companions, and two of them grabbed Sarah's arms, pulling her away from James despite her struggles. "Let me go, you can't do this." "Actually, we can do whatever we want," Eddie said. "We're the law out here, at least today." The men bound James's hands and feet with rope they had brought for the purpose, then dragged his unconscious form toward the creek. At the edge of the water, about 50 yards downstream from where Sarah and James had been sitting, was an old stone well that had been dug by homesteaders decades earlier. The well had been abandoned when the homestead failed, and over the years it had partially collapsed, leaving a dangerous hole about 20 feet deep with loose stones and debris at the bottom. "You see that well?" Eddie asked Sarah, pointing to the crumbling structure. "That's where your Indian boyfriend is going to disappear, and unless you want to join him, you're going to do exactly what we tell you." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she understood what Eddie was planning. "You can't murder him. People will ask questions. People will assume he fell into the well by accident," Eddie said. "Tragic accident, really. Young man walking alone at night doesn't see the danger, takes one wrong step. These things happen all the time. They'll know it wasn't an accident. They'll investigate. They'll find a drunk Indian who fell down a hole. Case closed." Eddie's smile was predatory. "Of course, if you want to ensure that the investigation is thorough, you could always report that you witnessed the accident. That would certainly complicate things." The threat was clear. If Sarah tried to expose what really happened, Eddie would claim that she had been present when James died, making her either complicit in his death or at least a witness who had failed to prevent it. As Eddie's men dragged James toward the well, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Instead of continuing to plead or threaten, she began to scream. Not words, just pure sound, as loud and as piercing as her lungs would allow. The sound echoed across the prairie, carrying farther than spoken words ever could. "Shut her up!" Eddie hissed. But when Jake Morrison moved to gag her, Sarah bit his hand so hard she drew blood. Her screaming continued, and now she could see uncertainty beginning to creep into the faces of Eddie's men. This wasn't going according to plan. They had expected to terrorize their victims into submission, but Sarah's refusal to be intimidated was making them nervous. "Eddie," Pete Williams said, still nursing his injuries from James's punch, "maybe we should reconsider this." "If someone hears her, nobody's going to hear her," Eddie said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We're miles from anywhere." But even as he spoke, Eddie could see dust clouds on the horizon, and his heart sank as he realized that someone was indeed coming. Sarah's screams had carried farther than he had thought possible, and now they were about to have company. The first rider to appear was Sheriff Patterson, followed by Robert Martinez and two of his ranch hands. Behind them came Walking Bear and three other men from the reservation. Sarah's screams had been heard by a hunting party that had been tracking deer in the area, and they had immediately ridden toward the sound of distress. Eddie's carefully planned act of revenge had become a nightmare. Instead of 6 men intimidating 2 helpless victims, they now faced an armed posse that outnumbered them and had the law on their side. "Drop your weapons," Sheriff Patterson shouted as he dismounted. "All of you, right now!" For a moment, it seemed like Eddie might try to fight his way out of the situation. He looked at the well where James lay unconscious, then at Sarah, then at the approaching lawman. Sarah could see him calculating his chances, trying to figure out if there was still a way to salvage his plan. But then Walking Bear spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of age and wisdom. "Eddie Fletcher," the old man said, "your grandfather was a good man who would be ashamed of what you have become. You have one chance to do the honorable thing. Take it." The fight went out of Eddie all at once. He dropped his rifle and raised his hands, and his companions followed suit. Within minutes, all 6 men were under arrest, and James was being carefully lifted away from the edge of the well that had merely become his grave. James regained consciousness as Dr. Henderson was examining his injuries. His face was a mass of bruises and cuts. He had 2 broken ribs, and his left arm was fractured, but he was alive. More importantly, his mind was clear and his spirit unbroken. "Sarah?" he whispered, and she was beside him immediately. "I'm here. I'm all right. What happened to the others?" "They're under arrest," Robert Martinez said, his face grim with anger. "All of them." James tried to sit up, winced with pain, and allowed himself to be helped into a more comfortable position. "How did you find us?" he asked. "We heard Sarah screaming from nearly a mile away," Sheriff Patterson replied. Walking Bear's hunting party heard it too, and we met up on the way here. James turned to look at Sarah, and despite his injuries, he managed to smile. You saved my life. You've saved mine more times than I can count, Sarah replied, taking his uninjured hand. I just returned the favor. The trial of Eddie Fletcher and his conspirators became the biggest news in Millbrook's history. The evidence against them was overwhelming, not just because of the eyewitness testimony, but because Eddie had been foolish enough to confide his plans to several people who had no stomach for actual violence when it came down to it. Tommy Fletcher, still in jail awaiting his own trial, found himself facing additional charges as an accessory to attempted murder, since Eddie's plan had been motivated by a desire to avenge Tommy's humiliation. The Fletcher family's reputation, already damaged by Tommy's actions at the social, was now completely destroyed. But the real impact of the incident was the way it changed attitudes in Millbrook. People who had been quietly uncomfortable with the idea of a relationship between Sarah and James found themselves forced to confront the reality of what racial prejudice actually looked like when it was taken to its logical extreme. The sight of James's battered face and the knowledge of how close he had come to being murdered in cold blood made abstract bigotry into something concrete and horrifying. The town's newspaper, which had previously maintained a careful neutrality on matters of race, published a searing editorial condemning the attack and calling for the community to examine its conscience about the treatment of its Native American neighbors. The church organized a special service of reconciliation, and several prominent families made public statements of support for Sarah and James's right to be together. It wasn't universal acceptance, and there were still plenty of people who disapproved of their relationship, but the violence had shifted the conversation in a way that mere words never could have. People might still harbor private prejudices, but they were now much more careful about expressing them publicly. Sarah and James were married 6 months later, in a ceremony that was attended by people from both the town and the reservation. Walking Bear performed the traditional Native American portions of the ceremony, while Reverend Matthews handled the Christian elements. Sarah wore her grandmother's wedding dress, and James wore a shirt that his grandmother had made for him, decorated with beadwork that told the story of their love. Robert Martinez walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, not because he was losing her, but because he was gaining a son-in-law who had proven his worth under the most extreme circumstances possible. Elena Martinez had spent weeks learning traditional recipes from James's grandmother, determined to show respect for the family her daughter was joining. The wedding reception was held on the Martinez ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and music provided by musicians from both communities. There was traditional mariachi music and Native American drumming, square dancing, and traditional circle dances. It was a celebration that bridged two worlds, proving that love could indeed conquer the barriers that society tried to erect. Tommy Fletcher was sentenced to 5 years in prison for theft, conspiracy, and accessory to attempted murder. Eddie Fletcher and his co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement in the attack. None of them ever returned to Millbrook after their release. Sarah and James built a house on the border between the town and the reservation, a symbolic location that reflected their role as bridges between two communities. James continued teaching, but he also began working with the town's school system to develop programs that would help children from both communities understand and appreciate each other's cultures. Sarah started a library that served both the town and the reservation, becoming a place where people from different backgrounds could come together to learn and share stories. She also wrote extensively about her experiences, and her articles were published in newspapers throughout the region, helping to change attitudes about interracial relationships and Native American rights. They had 4 children together, each of whom grew up fully comfortable in both worlds and proud of their mixed heritage. Their eldest son became a lawyer and fought for Native American rights in court. Their daughter became a doctor and provided healthcare to underserved communities throughout the region. Their younger children became teachers and community leaders, continuing the work of building bridges between different peoples. Walking Bear lived to be 90 to 8 years old, long enough to see his great-grandchildren grow up in a world that was far from perfect, but significantly more tolerant than the one he had been born into. Before he died, he told James that saving Sarah and exposing Tommy Fletcher had been one of the most important things their family had ever done, not because it had prevented one act of violence, but because it had shown people what was possible when courage and love worked together. The old well where James had nearly died was filled in and covered with a stone marker that read, "In memory of all those who have suffered for love, and in honor of those who refuse to let hatred triumph." It became a place where young couples from both communities would come to pledge their commitment to each other, and where parents would bring their children to teach them about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Years later, when Sarah was an old woman with silver hair and grandchildren playing at her feet, she would often sit on the porch of the house she and James had built together and think about that terrible Sunday afternoon when everything had nearly ended before it had truly begun. She would remember the fear and the violence, but she would also remember the moment when she had decided to scream rather than submit, and how that decision had changed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. James would join her on those evenings, moving more slowly now, but still with the quiet dignity that had first attracted her to him all those years ago. They would sit together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the prairie that had witnessed so much conflict and so much love. "Do you ever regret it?" James would sometimes ask, referring not to any specific moment, but to the entire journey they had taken together. "Never," Sarah would always reply, "not for a single moment." The path they had chosen had been difficult and dangerous, marked by hatred and violence from some, but also by unexpected support and love from others. They had faced down bigotry and survived attempted murder, but they had also built something beautiful together, something that had made the world a little bit better for their having been in it. Their story became legend in Millbrook, passed down from parents to children as an example of what was possible when people refused to accept the limitations that society tried to place on love. It wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending, but it was something better. A real story about real people who had found the courage to love each other despite everything the world had done to keep them apart. And in the end, that courage had been enough to save not just their own lives, but to begin the long, slow work of saving their community's soul as well.